Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Ivy Bolthouse. I'm a senior at Fond du Lac High School. I've been going to this church since I was 4. You probably know me. So to start off the service, it just helps because we know that everyone is at different steps in learning about these issues. And so to start it off, I'm going to kind of go over some of the basic terms, just to give everyone a little bit more information so you know when people are talking about with all this vocab, like, oh, what does that mean? And you don't want to, sometimes it's hard to ask, like, well, what does that mean? Because you don't want to feel ignorant, but it's okay, like we're all in a learning process together. There's things that I don't know, there's things that haven't, like words that haven't been invented yet, so here we go. So to start off, we're going to talk about sexuality because in general, most people have more of a knowledge about that. So here's a list of some words that are commonly used. You probably know many of them. And so if you just want to read them, I could read them out to you, but I'm not going to do that. So all of those would be under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, except for straight at the bottom. And this is just a small amount of the different words that people might use to describe their attraction and their sexual orientation. There's more than just this. I think also on the sheet, if y'all grabbed handouts when you walked in, there's the LGBT Center from UW Milwaukee has a great resource, so I think there's some other terms on there as well. So now gender is usually where it gets a little bit more confusing. So sex is something that you're assigned at birth. Everyone is assigned a sex, or sometimes people will say gender, at birth. That's when we talk about sex, we're talking about like the chromosomes, like XY or possibly XXY. Some people do have different chromosomes. A sex is also not a binary thing, it's not one or the other. Intersex people exist, so these might be people who have different chromosomes, different hormone levels in their bodies when they're born, and intersex people are actually as common as natural redheads. So oftentimes we say like, oh, well, like there's only 2 different bodies that someone can have, but in reality, like if you know a natural redhead, you know someone who's intersex. So, yeah. So then, sex is also different than gender. So sex is something that you're assigned at birth, and you're usually expected to follow the gender that goes with that. So most people, like if you're assigned male at birth, you're expected to have your gender also be male. If you're assigned female, you're expected to identify as female. However, gender identity is a lot more expansive than that. And we know that trans people exist. Cis people, so CIS, gender people, are people who were assigned, so male or female at birth, and they, all through their life, they identify that. So they're like, I was born and the doctor said it's a girl, and I am a girl, and I am a woman. But not everyone fits that, and that's what we would call a transgender person. It's not transgendered with ED on the end, there's no ED, because in our language that means it's like a verb form that something has happened to someone. Trans people, nothing happened to them to make them trans. That's just an adjective to describe gender. So gender is something that's in the brain, it's how people view themselves in society, how they want people to refer to them as, like how they feel they are. So everyone has all of these things. Gender identity is also different than expression, which we saw in the book that Christopher read. So that little kid said, like, I'm a boy, but he also wanted to wear a dress. And so, like, those things can be different. People can wear clothes that maybe don't match their expected for their gender. So, yes. And so using those things, it's really great to be able to visualize it. So here's our little friend, the gender unicorn. So gender identity, you can see, is what the little unicorn is thinking. So if they feel, it's like, and also it's important, you can see these are all like a sliding scale, because gender and sexuality and expression are all fluid. Someone might, at one point in their life, identify as one gender and later decide to transition, or to, like, their feelings just change, because like we're all people who over time we might change our opinions and change like the way we live, and just people are fluid. So and attraction too can change. So you can see like gender, male, female, or other genders, which we will talk about. Then gender expression, if someone dresses masculinely, femininely, or maybe they kind of do a mixture of both. And sex assigned at birth, like we said, female, male, and then other or intersex. Usually intersex people are like assigned a binary gender at birth, even if they maybe have a condition. But there are people who they've recognized as being born as intersex now. This was like less common in the past, but now there are people are being better about babies who are born intersex and to wait to do any kind of surgeries to them until they're older. And then physically attracted and emotionally attracted. So not everyone, so some people feel like they might be like emotionally attracted to some genders and sexually attracted to others. And so you can see men, women, and other genders. So with gender identity, we in our society kind of live in a binary. So binary means like one or the other. You know anything about computers? And so the binary in our Western culture is so man or woman. However, there are other genders, and I think what it's really important is to recognize that the way that we see gender as a one or the other is a Western concept. Cultures all throughout history and time, and continue now, around the world have not had the same one or the other binary. So examples are in India, there's a third gender. In Mexico, there's a third gender. Thailand, the Philippines, Native Americans recognize more than two genders. Native Hawaiians, I could go on. But we have just, I think it's really important to realize that like other genders aren't like a trend. It's not something like, oh, you know, like those millennials always, you know, making up genders. It's like, no, actually, this has existed for thousands and thousands of years in non-white culture. And to say that it's some new thing is really like erasing of people who've been living their lives outside of a binary for years and years. Unfortunately, lots of them have been erased because of like oppression and like assimilation when imperialism, like the Western colonization happened. And so oftentimes those people were forced to assimilate to the Western binary. But I know like there's lots of movements now, especially like Two-Spirit, so for Native Americans to like reclaim that non-binary identity. So beyond the binary, so like we said, gender, right now we kind of consider it to be a binary either or thing, but most people like really, I mean, we're people first before we are genders, is what I like to say. And so I think that we can kind of, use some different language that can help. That's what Paisley had joked before. And so, what am I saying? To help encourage like using language that isn't binary, like saying ladies and gentlemen, that can be erasing of people whose identities don't fit maybe the mold. We can say like, hey y'all, or like, hey people, like listen up. We can say like, welcome friends, like welcome, if you need to be formal, instead of saying like ladies and gentlemen, you could say like distinguished guests. That's always fun. Saying just kiddos, kids, young people. Instead of saying like he or she, if you're talking about someone like who's unknown, you could say they. We can also say, we say a lot of like brothers and sisters. We could say brothers and sisters, or just siblings, because that encompasses it all. Siblings include brothers and sisters. And because we know that the binary is hurtful to many people who live and feel outside of it, we can say all genders, because we're not going to get into this totally, but under like the non-binary umbrella, there's many specific identities. Like the specific ones from the different cultures would fit under there. There's also people who feel like their gender moves, like day by day. People have created other words to describe their personal feelings, but that all lies under just a non-binary umbrella. And then with gender, it's also important to talk about pronouns. This is definitely something that becomes a little bit harder just because in our society we use she or he for pretty much everyone. However, I did put some of these other pronouns up there. So they, them, theirs is a very common one for people to use who do not view themselves in the binary. And with that, you would just refer to the person as almost like as two people. So if you're just like thinking, oh, that's their whatever, their clothes, that's their hair, that's their food. It's also, I mean, we in general in English will use that, like if someone left their phone, like I said just now, their phone, like, oh, whose phone is this? Someone left their phone, because if we don't usually know, in general when we talk, we wouldn't say who left his or her phone here. We naturally just say they in a singular context, and because it obviously isn't more than one person's phone. So saying they or them is good if you don't know, like, the person, what they prefer. Then also sie, here, hers is a common set. I think it came from German, and lots of people will use that. It's kind of a combination of his and her, makes here. Pers is like short for person, because people like to be referred to as a person. Ve, ver, vers is also like airs. And so these you can just kind of see, like, instead of using one pronoun, you would use the other. That's what helped me to be able to use people's pronouns, was to think, okay, well, if I was going to refer to the person as she, now which one would I use instead? And then you can go, okay, picture it, per, or they, or name. Some people prefer not to use pronouns, and they would just, like, use their name. So, like, this person, and then, like, name has to go to name's house and get name's dog. Yes, please go get the dog. We love dogs. So I think definitely, like, the pronouns and the language is what's the hardest, because I think that we can all, like, recognize that there's, like, gender is expansive and gender is fluid, but, like, retraining ourselves is definitely the hardest part, like, for everyone, for using, yeah, my mother is nodding. So, like, especially, like, pronouns and gendered language, but, like, I think just, like, making a conscious effort can really do a lot for people, so they don't feel, like, erased. And then also, so I know that this is just really, like, the tip of the iceberg for everything that exists, but I think we're going to have some talk back later. I am totally open to answering questions. Trust me, I've done freshman health presentations. Y'all are not going to ask as weird of questions as I've gotten freshmen. Oh my gosh. So, alright, I'm going to hand it over to Christopher.
And it was actually kind of going off what Ivy was just talking about intersex. The acronym that I use for LGBT is normally LGBTI+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex plus. That covers the spectrum that I feel is what I use, so that's what I'll be using today. And then with her redhead comment, it's actually interesting to see that current data within the past couple of months, it says that on average, anywhere from 1 in 1,100 to 2,000 children are born intersex. So it is just as common as anybody. I'm a natural redhead, so I'm sure one of y'all know. Somebody who is intersex, and even with that term too, as she was explaining about umbrella terms, intersex is just an umbrella term for so many. The list, there's over about 50 different conditions that fit under that term intersex. So there's a lot. That's something that's obviously been around, as Ivy stated, for centuries now, but it's becoming more mainstream into our media with children not having surgeries right away, parents being able to choose when they're older, or let their child choose, and medical staff being more accurate and knowledgeable about situations in that. So I'm going to be reading some just stuff that I wrote here today, just kind of about macro issues within the LGBTI communities here in the United States. If I do talk too fast or need me to pull the microphone up, just shout. Sometimes if I get a little nervous, I do very fast speaking. So like various forms of inequalities among minorities, there are often many issues that go unnoticed by individuals that don't necessarily identify within a certain community. This is especially true for LGBTI plus peoples, as many believe that we now have the right to marry, sometimes often referred to as same-sex marriage, marriage equality, or gay marriage. We can just call that marriage. Roughly 3 years ago, that all other forms of discrimination within our community ceased to exist. Though the average citizen may think all of our problems were solved in 2015 with the Ogerbefell versus Hodges case, which gave those who chose to marry and their families the right to do so, and also a range of economic and legal protections, acceptance within the LGBTI community has slowly been decreasing since then, as a survey conducted by the Harris Poll on behalf of the LGBT media organization GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, shows America's comfortability towards LGBTI citizens going from 53% in 2016 and decreasing to 49% in 2017. And then over 30% of those respondees did report that they felt either somewhat or very uncomfortable around people who don't fit on that heterosexual or gender scale that they're most comfortable with. And although under the Obama administration things were beginning to look up as many battles were won, our present and future state doesn't appear to be quite as bright as what we'd hoped. And with that, since Trump's administration coming in, nearly almost over 1/5 of our states have already begun banning LGBTI couples the right to adopt or foster children, with many states following suit. Aiding in that, businesses are also legally denying services to individuals based on sexual orientation and or gender identity. And most recently, we saw this with our Supreme Court ruling in favor of Mr. Phillips, the bakery owner who denied services to a gay couple as he didn't want to use his talent to convey a message that he didn't agree with. And then with that, hate is also spread through our politicians, such as President Trump's unconstitutional ban on transgender servicemen and women in the United States military, and religious freedom laws that are increasingly being distorted and exploited to justify discrimination against LGBTI individuals, as well as women and people of colors. Aiding in there, kind of as Ivy said, explaining this, there are so many other examples and stories that we could share here with you today, but to keep it in short, we're just trying to stick with what we can fit in at a time. What I mainly want to highlight today are just the controversies that relate around religious freedom laws, which use faith-based ideologies and religious liberties to legally discriminate against another being whose values and moral beliefs don't align with theirs. The recent drive for religious exemption is not born of a neutral concern with religious liberty, but is largely the product of resistance to recent gains in the LGBTI community across the United States. The Human Rights Watch shares that some proposed bills that have pertained specifically to wedding-related services, for example, bakers, caterers, florists, photographers, videographers, venues, and etc., and proposed bills also include the right for adoption or foster agencies to deny rights to couples or individuals looking to start families, as well as allowing the government to deny funds and contracts to organizations that promote issues such as pro-LGBTI, pro-life, and other more liberal-related ideas. Other bills have been far broader, which prohibit the government from denying funds or contracts to organizations that discriminate based on religious and in some cases, moral beliefs, and this is specifically true in provisions of adoption and foster care services, healthcare, mental health care providers, housing, and more. Alongside these, government backing for legal discrimination has prompted various other fields, such as reproductive services, childcare, medical service, retail and service establishments, hotels, restaurants, recreational facilities, homeless shelters, transportation services, funeral services, and multiple other forms of public accommodations to do the same thing. In addition to these, many churches and religious organizations nationwide are using their free speech to spread hate through religious liberty protections, with the most common most likely being the Westboro Baptist Church, which I'm sure most of us in this room have heard of, and their common and most well-known phrase, "God hates fags," which on their website states is a profound theological statement which the world needs to hear more than it needs oxygen, bread, and water. So I got a nice kick out of that. I didn't know that that slogan was going to keep me thriving for the rest of my life. So taking a look at their website, godhatesfags.com, it's just Yeah, there's no words to describe the hate that it just pulls out in it, and sadly I spent hours just reading everything yesterday, and it's just absolutely horrible. So along with the spread of hate that these religious organizations are doing, something that's becoming more mainstreamed and more talked about today is the use of conversion therapy and the promotion and support that these religious and organizations are giving towards that. Sometimes known as reparative or aversion therapy. The Human Rights Campaign states that this type of therapy as a range of dangerous and accredited practices that falsely claim to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity/expression. Such practices have been rejected by every mainstream medical and mental health organization for decades, but due to continuing discrimination and societal bias against LGBTI peoples, some practitioners continue to conduct the type of therapy. And when it comes to the different types of name, conversion, reparative, aversion, conversion and apparative are very similar into the sense of just wanting to change someone's sexual identity, orientation, or expression. And then when you kind of move on to the scales of aversion, that's when it can start being more physical torture, actually causing pain and sensation related to such practices or thoughts. So those are just kind of the difference in words there. And especially when it comes to this, minors are especially vulnerable, and conversion therapy can lead to depression, anxiety, drug use, homelessness, alcohol and other drug addictions, suicide, and other increasing mental illnesses. The San Francisco State University found that individuals that have underwent conversion therapy are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide, 6 times more likely to report high levels of depression or other mental illnesses, 3 times more likely to become addicted to illegal drugs and alcohol, and 3 times more likely to contract HIV and AIDS or other STIs when being promiscuous and trying to hide their sexuality and keep it a secret. As stated above, almost all major medical associations have discouraged the use of this therapy and have 0 scientific data that back the use of it to prove that it changes one's sexual orientation, identity, or expression. To date, California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, Washington, and the District of Columbia have enacted laws or regulations to protect minors from being subjected to conversion therapy by state licensed mental health providers. Additionally, a growing number of municipalities have enacted similar protections, which is also ongoing here in Wisconsin. It just recently happened with Madison, Milwaukee, and then I know that Sherwood has kind of like a proclamation that it's not banned within the city limits of it, but the city council members themselves have put out a statement saying how they disagree with it and all the medical science behind it that causes trauma, so on and so forth. What's nice though is continuing support to ban conversion therapy nationwide has been in the works, and thankfully many states are adapting such laws even with such extreme backlash. I know kind of a major setback for the LGBTI community recently is that a bill was just proposed for Maine to ban conversion therapy within that state, and the governor actually vetoed the bill. So that's kind of a bummer where we're going on with that. But with everything going on, there has been so much more media attention related around everything when it comes to religious liberty laws and freedoms, and I include conversion therapy in that. And a lot of people are thinking with the administration that is happening that things are going to get worse, but I can say that the LGBTI community, we, just like any other minority, have gone through the ringer and around, and we're here to stay. So we'll make sure that it definitely changes. And just to finish up here, President Trump may have been able to remove all information regarding LGBTI individuals from any government-ran webpage, but he'll never be able to remove us from society, because as Harvey Milk said, hope will never be silent, and neither will we. To those that support us, there is no better time to act than now, and your help is always needed and always wanted. To those against us, we're always standing on the side of love, and love is a terrible thing to hate, so good luck. They'll need it. And now the wonderful Paisley Harris.
Well, those were 2 really hard acts to follow, so yes. I'll try to keep it a little bit short. But my place up here is mostly as a supporter, longtime activist, and ally and also a longtime teacher in, my main field is history, but I also teach Introduction to Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. And I also, I identify as, cisgender, middle-aged, white, basically straight. And I don't want to assume anybody's identities, but I think there might be at least one other person in the room who might identify with some of those aspects. And so maybe from that perspective, and also as a very strong ally, that might be a helpful perspective to share. And I said, that I would address some frequently asked questions, but I really think Ivy, has done a lot of that, and as I was preparing, I thought that's not really, I think, what I'm here to do. And I used, I'm using a little bit of poetry from a woman named Adrienne Rich, not so much poetry, but just some quotes from Adrienne Rich, who is a poet. And she is a longtime feminist and lesbian, and a lot of her sayings and quotes kind of crystallized more some feelings and perspectives that I thought might be good to share. And the first point I wanted to make was around language and naming and what we see, right? And if you don't have a language for something, you don't have a word for it, you may not see it, right? And our language reflects what we see and understand, and then it shapes it too. And I think today that young people especially, and many people in our society, are taking responsibility for identifying themselves and naming. And yes, there's more words and there's more names, and that's because that shows there's a better understanding of the complexity of humanity, and that's a good thing. So a quote from Adrienne Rich: "Responsibility to yourself means refusing to let others do your thinking, talking, and naming for you. It means learning to respect and use your own brains and instincts, and hence grappling with the hard work." And I think so many people in our society today, especially young people, are doing that, right? And they're helping to lead some of us that maybe are a little slower on those things to see and grapple more with the complexity of gender identity and of sexual orientation, which today my understanding is as professionals see that as more of a spectrum, not even just you're heterosexual or you're quote homosexual. Or bisexual, that there's a spectrum of about maybe 7 or more positions of where you might fall on that sexual orientation. Another good quote along from Adrienne Rich to maybe make us think about this: "Until we know the assumptions in which we are drenched, we cannot know ourselves." Right? And I think in Western society we're very drenched in this male-female binary assumption. Right? And Ivy has already gone into that, I think, very, very well. And also very drenched in the assumption that unless somebody is out and says something, that everybody's heterosexual. Not true, right? That's an assumption, and we're so drenched in it that we don't tend to see it. And what we see, and seeing is changing, right? So I think it's important to, even if we're just seeing more and naming more and yes, having more terms, because it's helping us see that complexity better. That's helping to change the world in a positive way. Both Ivy and Christopher talked a little bit about how prevalent really people being intersex is. And the numbers I have heard are, I was somewhere closer to maybe 1 in 20, 1 in 11. But that's a high number, I've also heard the percentage of about 1.7% of the population. If that's accurate, that's about 5,500,000 people in the United States. It's about 700 people in Fond du Lac. And again, those numbers might be a little bit low. There's some estimates that are a lot higher than that. And language and naming are power. Right, and so if you're just saying, well, that's just too many words, I'm not going to learn any of those, then that's taking away some power, right? So the more we can try to let the people who are most involved and affected and help us with naming, and to let people name themselves, that's letting them take power, over their identities, and letting us all take power over our identities. All right. And these are, again, just kind of my perspectives. Another thing I just wanted to mention was complexity, right? And I think there is no one truth, and that's, again, kind of going off of Adrienne Rich. There's no the truth. The truth is not one thing or even a system. It's really an increasing complexity, right? And I think that we're in a time now where we're understanding that more. And to put it at a more personal level, Adrienne Rich said, if you think you can grasp me, think again. I think we often try to put people in a box. Oh, that person is asking to be called she, but they really look like a he to me. Well, maybe you're just not grasping that person, and it's up to them who they are, and to try to work with that. Right? So if you think you can grasp me, think again. My story flows in more than one direction, a delta springing from the riverbed with its 5 fingers spread. I try to see complexity not as frustrating, but as a positive. Very binary, fixed definitions are just not as rich and complex enough. So I think that questioning, it means there's more words and there's maybe more to learn. But I think that's all a positive. And then I wanted to say something about uncomfortableness. Right? And the politics of comfort and discomfort. And being, uncomfortable is, especially if you're a pretty privileged person, really isn't an emergency. Again, Adrienne Rich said, you look at me like I'm an emergency. Right? And I think that some transgender people probably have that experience a lot. A lot of guys who are wearing dresses. A lot of fairly female-looking people who are growing facial hair because they're transitioning, they probably have that experience that they are looked at as an emergency, and they're definitely not, right? It's not an emergency. No person is an emergency. They're all people, right? It's not an emergency that somebody wants to be called they, and it frustrates you because it's plural. Not an emergency, get used to it. You can figure out by context when someone is using they or their as a singular, and I know a lot of English professors who have learned that this is not an emergency. Right? Just in general, I think being uncomfortable as relatively privileged people is not an emergency, and if we can think about and work on, not push away that, oh God, I'm uncomfortable, I'm such a horrible prejudiced person, but note that and then think about what in yourself you could work on, to be more comfortable and just accept people, as people. But on the other hand, I think for those who are marginalized, for someone who is transgender and they're constantly, somebody's trying to put them in some box, it doesn't work. I think that constantly being in a state of discomfort, that's a form of oppression, right? That people who are more privileged can help with, and can try to make that less true for them. And I think it's really important to try to help people who are marginalized by society feel more comfortable. I also wanted to say, I think in this day and time, as like the middle-aged white cisgender person, it's not really my time to be creating the vocabulary and taking the lead on that. I think it's a time where young people, where people of color they want to name the identifiers, and they're not many people of color and many people who are not heterosexual, and so on, they're not necessarily completely worried about whether some of us all are comfortable, right? And I think it's upon us right now. I think we're being called to try to work on being more comfortable and try and work on letting other people set the vocabulary and so on, and think about how powerful names and words can be. Right? Like whoever came up with that term for pro-life, for that other people besides a woman in whose a baby is growing, whom a life is growing, that it's anything other than, it has to be her choice, in the end, because that's where it's happening. think about the term populist, you know, for people who are racist and not wanting to accept many of the population. So I think the right wing has done a lot of this naming and vocabulary. And I think right now it's very important that we hear and that we are listening to the vocabulary of, you know, of pansexual and using cisgender and so on. And those are both words that when I started to teach in gender studies, those terms were not being used, right? And that also meant that understanding that feeling the same gender identity that you were assigned at birth, that's actually a kind of identity, and it's not just sort of assumed truth, right? The final thing I wanted to say was to just, you know, remind us that we are a welcoming congregation, and that's really important. And I think it's really important that we're a place where people can be themselves. And again, Adrienne Rich put things very well. She said, no person who's trying to take responsibility for her or his or their, she didn't say that, but I'll say that, or their identity should have to be so alone. There must be those among whom we can sit down and weep, and I would add, and worship and stand and sing and explore our spirituality, and still be counted as warriors and be included. Right? It's really important, I think, especially in this community, to have a place where people who are gay or lesbian, bi, transgender, intersexual, pansexual, you know, can feel that they can come and be part of a spiritual community. So that's the importance of our being a welcoming congregation. And I think now we'll sing. I know we're a little bit over, but I still want to. We want to hear the music, and we'll.